Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. This week started with a major rejig in the UK cabinet, with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak sacking Suella Braverman as the Home Secretary and David Cameron returning to UK politics as the new Foreign Secretary. And soon after he joined office, Cameron made his first overseas trip as the Foreign Secretary to the war-struck Ukraine. He pledged continued military support to Ukraine till wherever needed and a refocus on the country as Russia continues to attack its neighbour. Talking about Suella Braverman's removal from the cabinet, the decision was taken after her insubordination to the Prime Minister, but she has also had disagreements with the Prime Minister over his handling of the illegal immigration issue. Braverman, as we know, has been publicly critical of the illegal migration to UK in her letter after her sacking. Braverman accused Rishi Sunak of betraying the British people on his promise to stop illegal migration to the UK. The Rwanda plan proposal was struck down by Boris Johnson government in 2022. It also didn't stand in the UK Supreme Court, with the court calling the proposal as unlawful. Prime Minister Sunak is now considering bringing an emergency law to declare Rwanda as a safe destination for illegal migrants. Sunak has also rejected Braverman's claims, saying he will do whatever it takes to make the Rwanda plan up and running. Let me now go across to our guests. We are joined by Navtej, Sarna, former Indian ambassador to the UK, and Nigel, Fletcher, Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at King's College, London. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Ambassador Sarna, what were the political compulsions which led to the sacking of Braverman and bringing back David Cameron, who has also had a checkered past over the last 6 to 7 years, including his interests in China? The opposition in the UK has called on the Sunak government to make his financial transactions, to make Cameron's financial transactions and business transactions absolutely crystal clear.
Thank you, Parikshit. I think what we've seen over the last week or so is actually a continuation of the chaos we have been seeing in British politics over the last couple of years. Certainly since the last year, when you had a very short-term Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and then the change. I think there has been a sort of growing feeling that the Sunak cabinet is, and in fact the British government on several issues does not give a sense of confidence, does not give a sense of stability. And Braverman's comments, really possibly thinking from Rishi Sunak's point of view, have been upsetting a lot of the moderate conservatives or the centrist conservatives. So I think finally things broke when she made, criticized the Met Police on the handling of the marches in support of Palestine, and some of the language used in that is really open to question. It's also the fact that she helped him come to power. Which she has made clear in the letter which she has written, that there were several deals between them, which she accuses the Prime Minister of not fulfilling. Now, as to why David Cameron has been brought in, I think it is a matter of surprise. It is a matter of some bemusement, because it's very rarely that a former Prime Minister, I think it probably happened once in the 70s, from what I read, has come back to join the cabinet. And now David Cameron does have a standing. He does have an international presence. He does have relationships with several countries. So that probably will help in the current very volatile global situation. But it also comes, as you rightly said, with a lot of baggage. It's a baggage of Brexit, first to begin with. I mean, he was arguing in favor of Remain. He never thought that the referendum that he had called for would actually be lost. And he comes with not a very good foreign policy plate. The mix up on Libya, on Syria, on actually uniting Europe against Britain. So there is a huge amount of baggage. The softness on China, which we can discuss if you like, and also the personal integrity factors after demitting office in a manner in which he sort of seemed to desert the country when things got tough after Brexit.
Right.
And and then the personal things which you have already mentioned.
Okay, you're absolutely right. many have expressed surprise at David Cameron's return. What does this mean, Dr. Fletcher, when it comes to UK's ties with China? At some level, do you think the Sunak government is revisiting its policy on China, and that is the reason that David Cameron is being brought back, or is it purely a domestic political issue?
Well, I think it will be very interesting to see whether on China and a whole range of other issues, this signals a change by Rishi Sunak in the direction of his government. Bringing back David Cameron, as we've just said, is a quite striking thing to have done. It was rather surreal, actually, on Monday morning when we saw David Cameron getting out of the car in Downing Street. Many of the commentators simply couldn't believe what they were seeing. It's really a very surprising thing to have done. But its meaning is not quite clear yet. David Cameron said in his first interview and in his statement on becoming Foreign Secretary that there are things that he's disagreed with Rishi Sunak on. Even in the last few weeks, really, he disagreed with the decision that was taken, for example, on cancelling a high-speed rail project. A number of things like that he's disagreed with. He disagreed significantly with Boris Johnson as well. So I think we're looking to see whether this means that Rishi Sunak has just decided to tack more to the centre in domestic politics, to adopt a more moderate approach. But you're right, there are also questions on foreign policy, because that's the area David Cameron is coming into. And as someone who has had quite a lot of involvement in his private business dealings with China, that's caused a degree of controversy. But also when he was Prime Minister as well, he was very keen to open up greater ties with China. There's a very famous a photo call that was done where he took the Chinese premier to his local pub near his home in Oxfordshire, and that became quite an iconic image, both in the UK and in China, in fact. And so there is a reminder here that the Cameron government was very different to some of the more sceptical approach that we've seen from, and indeed hostile approach that we've seen from some in the Conservative Party recently. Liz Truss, the Prime Minister last year, for the brief period that she was, took a very hard on China, and a number of other people share that view.
Very important. But let me now go across to Ambassador Sarna once again. Ambassador Sarna, if we speak about the Rwanda plan, after being struck down by the Supreme Court, Sunak has said that he'll do everything he can to get this plan up and running. He'll bring an emergency law if possible. What will be the implications of this? Why is Sunak pushing ahead on this? And do you expect the UK government to take a harder, a tougher stand on mobility visas, work mobility visas from India to UK as a result?
Well, I think there are two different things there. I mean, one is about illegal migration, on which Rishi Sunak has been very strong. It's been one of the top things on his stated agenda, that he's going to cut out the boats. And even after this Braverman letter, in the first reaction that came from Downing Street, he did say that, the boats have been cut down by 1/3. So I think he certainly can't give up that agenda. Whether the Rwanda plan still works is something which we have to see, because it's been opposed, it's been struck down by the Supreme Court. It goes against the European Convention on Human Rights. And I think now if they do bang through a special law which declares that Rwanda is safe, you don't know where and when that will be challenged again. Meanwhile, it seems from what one reads that, there are other destinations being considered, especially for countries whose asylum seekers don't have much of a chance of getting asylum. Albania is one case in point. Other European countries could possibly, in East and Central Europe, could possibly also come up as destinations. But to my mind, this whole thing of deporting people to another country and presumably on payment, and while their asylum papers are being processed, and to hope that they will not be sent back in the process of refoulement back to the original country. I mean, the whole thing sounds surreal, a word that my co-panelists very appropriately used.
Absolutely. Dr. Fletcher, talking to you about how India should be watching these developments in the UK, do you see any impact on FTA negotiations? They were not completed by Diwali. We don't know whether they'll be completed by the end of the year. We only know that there is an intention to bring a landing point soon. How do you think the reshuffle impacts relations with India and the FTA?
Well, I think, I'll go back to what I said before, which is that I think the impact of this reshuffle really is quite difficult to judge on trade and on foreign affairs and on a whole range of other issues. Rishi Sunak, I think we've got to remember here, has inherited a government that was not in a good shape, and after a period of time in recent years, where we've just had constant turmoil from Brexit through to COVID, the Johnson government, and then the Truss government. They weren't stable governments, and we've become used to a great degree of turmoil, and that has an impact on policy. It means that the people who are in these jobs are not staying for a particularly long period of time. And so when you're dealing with international negotiations, it's very difficult for anyone to really get a handle on the British government's position. I think what he'll be hoping for over the next sort of 6 months to a year until a general election is that he can project a sense of greater stability. He obviously wants to win that election. It's not looking very hopeful at the moment, but he'll want to, I think, try and project some stability. So I think there's going to be very limited opportunities for him to change many cabinet ministers between now and the election. This, I think, is the team going to go into the election with. So on trade negotiations, relations with India, and as we mentioned earlier, relations with other countries, notably China, it's going to be interesting to see how particularly David Cameron puts that in his speeches in the next few weeks or so, as we get a better sense of what he's doing, because there's not going to be much of an opportunity to change things after this until perhaps there's a change of government.
Right. So uncertainty will be there in UK politics for some time, at least. We've run out of time, but thank you very much, Ambassador Sarna and Dr. Fletcher, for joining us on the program. We are heading into a break, but on the other side, we discussed the big meeting between US and China in San Francisco on the 16th of November in an attempt to repair the strained relationship between both nations. We will be speaking to Victor Gao, and also we'll get you a special discussion on whether the world is moving towards an a la carte world order. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Shifting focus to the big meeting between US and China. US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping held a summit in San Francisco on the 16th of November in an attempt to repair the strained relationship between both nations. This was the first face-to-face meeting in a year and Xi Jinping's first visit to the US in 6 years. Both leaders said this meeting was among the most constructive and productive talks they have had. Let me now go across to Victor Gao, somebody who has worked very closely with the Chinese government and works with the Chinese think tank as well. Mr. Gao, let me begin by asking you, the Chinese government described the 4-hour meeting as quite productive, and they even went on to say that the San Francisco agreements, if in a way implemented, could be a new era in US-China ties. But do you think what President Biden said at the end of his press conference when asked whether he still would call President Xi Jinping a dictator, and he replied to that saying, in a way, I would, because he's the leader of a communist country. Do you think that somehow impacts whatever had been achieved in those 4 hours of negotiations and talks?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I would say the summit meeting in San Francisco is truly a new turning point in China-US relations. The two countries now have a new page to ride upon for whatever that they may do in the coming weeks, months, and probably a couple of years. And there may be a lot of heavy lifting to be done in the future. And the goal is to stabilize China-US relations, to prevent it from further deteriorating, and to see whether major milestones can be crossed. So don't be surprised in the coming weeks and months if you hear more good news in the aftermath of the summit meeting in San Francisco. Now, the second question you asked, yes, it is truly very unfortunate. I personally would urge President Biden to accept some professional counseling in answering questions. Some of the questions are traps that you do not need to voluntarily and very eagerly jump into. And I think from the Chinese perspective, we just need to focus on the positive side rather than being distracted by the negative side. The Chinese government has already condemned the misuse of the word that Biden used to describe the Chinese leader, which is completely unacceptable. However, I think this is the time when China and the United States need to focus on the right thing, stabilize the relations, go forward to make sure that they have better relations, constructive of their own purposes, and generating more benefits for the Chinese people and the American people.
Right. Mr. Gao, very important statements from you, but I would like to ask you, there was a US attempt to set the guardrails in this relationship to not let the relationship deteriorate beyond a certain point. From the Chinese point of view, what would be the red line in the relationship with the US, which China would definitely not like crossed?
I would say China and President Xi Jinping emphasized to President Biden and the US government very clearly in the San Francisco summit. That is, the Taiwan issue is the red line of the red line of the red line. It's the most sensitive issue between China and the United States, and China urged the United States to continue to apply the One China policy, treating Taiwan as part of China. The United States has been operating on that basis since January the 1st, 1979. I don't see any reason why the United States wants to reverse itself, and China will never allow any country, including the United States, to recognize both China on the one hand and Taiwan on the other hand, because China always demands the One China policy and does not allow any country to break away from the One China policy or to treat China and Taiwan as two separate countries. Therefore, I think the fact that President Biden reiterated the One China policy and declared that he and the United States will not accept Taiwan independence is the right talk at the right time. We just need to see whether the United States government will walk the right walk in the coming weeks and months.
Okay, Victor Gao, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the program and having your analysis all the way from Beijing. Moving on, we get you a very special conversation. Is the world moving towards an a la carte world order? Well, citizens of countries around the world prefer that their governments pragmatically choose their partners depending on the issue at stake. This, according to a poll conducted by the European Council of Foreign Relations. In fact, we are joined by a senior fellow at ECFR right now, Susie Denson, senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, is joining us. This report is extremely timely, and I'd like to take away from what's happened in the UK, the return of David Cameron, and also what's happening at San Francisco, the kind of meeting and the positive words coming out of the meeting between President Biden and Xi Jinping. Do you think this whole conversation we heard for the last 3 to 4 years, especially after COVID-19, about decoupling from China, that argument is somewhat dead with the kind of events that we've seen over the last few weeks?
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I think the previous item, the US-China competition, is indeed still very much the framing for the way that other powers are thinking about this world. But what we're seeing is a set of powers who are choosing not to choose a side within that context. And so from that point of view, yes, I think the idea of decoupling is not where they are, and rather they are very confident in the ability to have issue-based relationships which can be compartmentalized. The idea of the a la carte world comes from data that we have, which shows the extent to which there is still a lot of identity between the countries we looked at, which included India, Turkey, Russia, as well as smaller powers such as South Korea, Indonesia, Brazil, and so on. But these countries, they see a lot of alignment when it comes with the West, when it comes to issues like human rights, control over the internet. They still place a lot of importance in the hard security guarantees from the US. But when it comes to trade, there was much more openness from these states to have a closer relationship with China. Interestingly, when we sort of pushed the question and said, if you had to choose which between a bloc led by the US and a bloc led by China, which would you like your country to be part of? There was more support for the Western bloc, but ultimately countries don't feel that they have to choose.
Right. Susie, important statements. I'd also like to ask you in the context of India. When it came to Russia, we, in a way, remain neutral. We continue to import energy from Russia. We continued our defense relations, our age-old relations. China, we've had very complex relations. So do you think India, when it comes to its relationship with China, should also implement this a la carte policy? Yes, you have a problem on the boundary, which is difficult to resolve. It's complicated. But on issues where there can be agreement, go ahead, focus on that and minimize disputes in the other. Do you think that is the best way forward for India-China relations as well?
Well, interestingly, when it came down to the question of trade, India was the country which showed the strongest preference still to align more closely with the Western bloc, with 65% of the respondents in India opting for the West, as opposed to only 12% opting for a China-led bloc, which looks quite different from most of the other powers. Brazil was perhaps the next closest at 50% for the West on that front. But I think that you're right, that the Russia situation is very central to, and the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine is very central to shaping the thinking of the smaller and middle-sized powers around the global order at the moment. And our data, it comes from pre-October the 7th, but I think that the Gaza conflict, which has erupted since then, is also very much shaping that picture and the West's response to that. What is very clear is that powers around the world are not expecting the Ukraine side to be able to push Russia back. They are expecting Russia to be able to win. And I think that that is potentially feeding into this sense of an issue-based world. They know that they might not like what other powers are doing, but they will still have to work in defense of their interests in different ways.
Right.
I think what we take away from the report at ECFR is a sense that countries are increasingly going to have to exercise what we talk about as strategic interdependence. So understanding what their interests are in each relationship, what their power is in that relationship, and investing accordingly in defense of those interests.
Right. And do you think the Middle East crisis, the war in Gaza, is going to push us more towards this pick and choose issue-based relationship? You don't need to work towards be aligning with either China or US for that matter. You can choose issue-based relationships even with your adversaries.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is that with these conflicts erupting, powers are having to consider quite firmly how their choices are being restricted. There's a strong sense in our data set that many countries are actually see the Ukraine conflict primarily as a regional conflict, but they're very much affected by the actions which Western powers are taking around them, including sanctions and the impact that that is having on energy prices, food supply chains, and so on. With the Gaza conflict, again, this isn't in our data set, but I think that was understood immediately as a conflict with potential regional and global repercussions. And I think that the effects of it will be considered in that sense, that they will need to continue to secure the relationships that matter for them in terms of their supply chains, for the tech that they need, for the resources that they need, and so on. And they will form relationships around that. That doesn't mean that they don't care about the issues at stake in these conflicts, but we are living in an interest-based world. And therefore, it is that and that economic security dimension which seems to be driving the foreign policy strategies of powers.
Okay, so interest-based world, economic policy driving decision-making. Thanks very much, Susie Denson, for joining us here on the program. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.